Hello everyone, this is your friend Shinobi Nexus 2.0. Welcome back to the channel. Enjoy the fanfic. And let's begin. What if a Naruto fan was reborn as Shikamaru's twin sister, and became a ninja genius? Part 1. Prologue. This is the Naruto universe. Yeah, imagine my surprise when I worked that one out. As far as reincarnations go, well, I can't tell you if it's a step up or a step down. I had always been safe before, born into a safe family, in a safe town, in a safe country. Now, here was a world where things were rough and wild and even civilized people hired assassins. Was this a step down the karmic ladder? Had I been a bad person? On the other hand, for all that this world was terrifying, I had narrowly missed a worse fate. I had been born to Konoha, arguably the nicest shinobi village, to a good family. I mean, in the stories, bad people are always reincarnated as ants and then stepped on, right? I don't know. I also don't know why I remembered. I was an average person. I had siblings and parents, but no partner or children. I had a basic university degree and an average job. I left no outstanding legacies and committed no unutterable crimes. When I died, I doubt very many people noticed at all. I'm not the kind of person you want to rely on to save the world. Maybe some god up there has a weird sense of humor. Maybe it was just an accident. I slipped through the cogs of cosmic reckoning and wasn't important enough to be noticed. I like that explanation best. But like I said before, I was born to Shikaku and Yoshino Nara in the Konoha General Hospital on the 22nd of September as the younger of twins. It sounds so amazing when said like that. A spiritual miracle. The truth was, at the time I had no idea what was happening. I was twisted and squeezed and the comforting darkness in which I had rested was torn away. There was pain and cold and terror. There was immediacy. Things that hadn't seemed important were suddenly at the forefront of my mind. What had happened? Where was I? Was I alive or dead, hurt or injured? What was going on? I couldn't tell. When babies are born, their eyes are incredibly undeveloped. The entire world was a blur to me. It wasn't quite color blindness, but the easiest thing to see was the stark contrast between light and dark. I could see shapes and edges, but the world looked incredibly confusing. I was scared, terrified. I didn't know what was happening. I could hear, yes, but not understand what was being said. Had I suffered brain damage? Did I have aphasia? The thought terrified me. I can think few worse fates than to be trapped with no method of communication to the world around me. But even that didn't explain everything. I was lifted and carried. I've always been on the short and thin side, but even that didn't explain the ease with which I was lifted or how I was being carried. I suppose I must have been held in the crook of someone's arm, but I could make no sense of the sensations at the time. It didn't fit. I did the only thing I could have. I screamed. I wailed. I cried. It sounds odd that I, as an adult in mind, should respond that way. But I was, in part, at least, ruled by the instincts of the new body I inhabited. Even had I attempted to speak, my vocal apparatus wasn't coordinated enough to allow it, not to mention the language barrier that was in place. So crying, the ultimate response to any kind of discomfort, it was. It's hard to convey just how frightening it was, to be helpless like that. I will admit to being a horrible baby. I was near blind, confused and helpless. My body didn't respond to me. And there was an unbearable itch inside me of forming chakra coils. In response, I cried. All the time. I feel bad about it now. It must have been an incredibly trying time for my new parents. I felt uncomfortable calling them Mum and Dad at first. They weren't my parents, the ones I remembered. On the other hand, I didn't know their names to start with, and I lacked the understanding of the language to pick them out. It left me in a quandary. Of course, that didn't last for that long. It was lonely, being a child. They were the only people I interacted with. They fed me, changed me, determined my schedule. It's impossible to rely on someone like that and not come to love them. They were, as most ninja parents are, fairly young when we were born. The war had only recently ended and they were probably still trying to adapt to the strange creature known as peacetime. They tried everything they could. And when that failed, they took me back to the hospital, afraid that something was wrong. Although I didn't learn it until much later, the medic diagnosed me as chakra hypersensitive. Literally, that my pain was caused by my own chakra system. It was a death blow to a ninja career. Ninjutsu, genjutsu, anything that required chakra, would simply be too painful to attempt. Even Lee, with his deformed coils, had managed to use chakra to enhance his body. What they didn't understand was that it was neither my body nor my chakra that was causing the issue, but my mind. Chakra was a limb I had never used, a sense I had never had, it was foreign and I didn't understand it. With knowledge and time, I would grow to be as comfortable with it as any other, if unusually aware of it, but at that point, I was not. At that point in time, I didn't even know what it was. All I could tell was that there was something inside me that had never been there before. It wasn't just my own chakra, though, there was chakra in everything, including the very air I breathed. Sometimes, when I woke up from deep sleep, I would be convinced that I was going to drown on it. I would cough and choke and hack and flail about in panic until it set in that it was just air. Of course, just when I was beginning to settle in, that event happened. I was 3 weeks old when the Kyuubi attack happened. Of course, I had no idea what was going on at that stage. I barely knew I was a child. But I remember the chakra. Evil isn't a word that I want to throw around lightly. But it was overwhelming, it was terrifying, it was malicious, and it was demonic. It was in the air like thick smoke and every breath I took made me choke on it. I was too terrified to scream. It was nameless and faceless to me, and that only made it worse. I couldn't quantify it or analyze it or understand it. It was an all-pervasive horror that I could neither resist or fight. It was like the devil had opened the gates of hell and breathed terror into the air. It was crippling. I thought it would drive me mad. For once, Shikamaru was screaming and I was quiet. There was no way I could make a sound. I was beyond that. That feeling of being helpless in the face of overwhelming terror stayed with me for a long time. It was something that has both terrified me and motivated me ever since. I am not ashamed to say I have had more nightmares about that day than I care to count. But that was a single event of terror. Most of my days were filled with mind-numbing boredom and a complete lack of control over myself and over the environment around me. Most of my time as a baby was spent sleeping and playing with my chakra, not that I knew what it was at that stage. But I desperately needed something to occupy my attention while I couldn't interact with the world around me. At first I was cautious with it, but when there seemed to be no effect to my manipulations, I grew bolder. Likely, it was enhancing my muscles even then, but since I wasn't mobile, there was no discernible difference. I did, however, get a good feel for my chakra, and probably developed very good control over it. Mostly though, I thought of it was something to occupy my adult brain, that was incredibly starved for stimulation. There's not really a way to describe how chakra feels. It's like having a second set of veins solely to transport hot chocolate around your body, warm and comforting. Or maybe coffee, awakening and revitalizing everything it touched. Manipulating it wasn't difficult. It wasn't like trying to tame a foreign entity, or herd cats, or direct water from a hose. It was a swirl of warm energy, not just directed by my mind, but part of it. It's so impossible to describe. My sight didn't fully develop until about 6 months of age, and that was when I started to realize exactly where I was. That was also around the time when my vocal cords were formed enough to begin speaking. I picked up on the spoken language easily, as children are wont to do. I didn't even have an accent, of which I was thankful, since that would have been difficult to explain. It was frustrating, though, trying to learn a new language like that. No wonder toddlers are famous for their temper tantrums. By the time I was a year old, the evidence for where I was mounting. Dad's standard attire was the shinobi flak jacket, and I had seen his headband. It wasn't until we went to the park one day and I looked up to see the Hokage mountain that I could no longer deny it. This was the Naruto universe. Oh, shit. Fear is the mother of foresight, Thomas Hardy. I didn't exactly jump for joy when I worked out where I was. Given that my twin brother was Shikamaru, I could guess pretty well what kind of time zone I was in. That didn't mean, however, that the world around me was canon, Naruto verse. Obviously, I was here and that was a factor that hadn't been present in the show. Many other things could be different. But even if it was canon, Konoha had been invaded, twice? Over the course of the show. There was the upcoming war. And not to mention, on a day-to-day basis over half the town were highly trained, slightly unstable, killers. I wouldn't recommend this place as a vacation, that's for sure. This was a world where only the strong and lucky survived. The weak, well, they choked to death on their own screams when the devil came to town. I did not, ever, want to be so helpless again. Like I said, the Kyuubi attack has motivated me ever since. There was never pressure on me to be a ninja. In fact, I doubt very much that my parents even thought I would be with my handicap. I could have stayed to look after the deer, I could have studied medicine, and that idea had appealed to me. The life of a ninja was rough and dangerous. But I had played it safe before to no avail. And there was no guarantee that playing it safe would save me. Civilians died far easier than shinobi, after all. Of course, as a toddler there wasn't much I could do. I soaked up the information that was offered to me, speaking, walking, games. I don't know what I would have done during those days without Shikamaru. He was my lifeline, my measuring stick. What rate of progress should I show, could I show? What things should I be learning? I have no doubt that I came off as an odd, deliberate child. I have the feeling that had I been born to any family other than the Nara, things would have been much trickier for me. They seemed completely unperturbed when I picked things up much faster than Shikamaru, my adult mind capable of grasping concepts easier, having much more experience learning. Given that the clan is as famed for their intelligence as their shadow jutsu, maybe it wasn't so uncommon. I tried to hold myself back, I truly did, but it was incredibly frustrating and I was desperately bored. Of course, now that I knew that the energy I felt was chakra, I remembered some things about how it was used. The idea of being able to walk up and down walls was just so cool that I had to try learn how. Almost as soon as I started to crawl, I began to try and channel chakra to help me stick to things. Of course, I learned quickly just how much chakra it actually took. It shouldn't have surprised me, given that I was expelling chakra through both hands and knees. The surface area of one palm alone is quite large, and to maintain a constant rate of chakra emission used up my small supply quite rapidly. There was a reason the serious ninjutsu training didn't start before 8 or 9. That was when chakra reserves began expanding beyond the essential chakra that fueled the body. I spent many days napping in the sunshine after exhausting myself, learning slowly where the line for chakra exhaustion was. It wasn't, by any means, a bad way of spending my days. I most certainly didn't attempt to climb vertically. Not only would that be suspicious, I would get maybe 3 or 4 steps up before falling. That wasn't something I really looked forward to. There were other chakra exercises that didn't take so much chakra. Anything that used chakra was technically a control exercise, and anything that was taught as a control exercise usually had other applications. Less draining than wall walking was the leaf sticking exercise, which didn't necessarily need leaves. The two exercises were opposite sides of the same coin, sticking yourself to something and sticking something to yourself. I used paper, blankets, my clothes, anything in reach. There were tiny, minute differences between the different materials and different fabrics that required slight adjustments in the amount of chakra needed and the rate it was expelled. Once you had something stuck to you and covered in chakra, you could manipulate it slightly. There were stories of medic nin with control so precise they could fold an origami crane out of rice paper without touching it. There were chakra strings to develop control over chakra outside the body. Chakra strings were tricky in concept, but there wasn't really much difference between creating 1 and 20, except in moving them after. Puppet users were masters of multitasking, apparently. Given that dozens of strings could be attached to each puppet, it was no wonder that Sasori's performance of 100 puppets was legendary. I couldn't even attach 2 strings to different objects without getting confused, let alone start moving them. By the time I was 2, and both Shikamaru and I were capable of talking in complete, if basic, sentences, though Shikamaru spoke rarely, I would toddle around the house with one of my story books, incessantly pestering anyone in the house to read it to me. The language was all written in Japanese, and I very, very much wanted to be able to read. I had studied Japanese once, years ago, though I will admit to never being very good at it, but it did mean I knew the difference between written Japanese and written English. English has a 26-letter alphabet, each one corresponding to a specific sound. Hiragana is a simple phonetic alphabet where each character represents a combined consonant-vowel combination and are sounded out to make words. Katakana is the same, but used mostly for foreign words. Kanji, though, kanji. There are thousands of them. The same kanji can mean different things, be pronounced differently, depending on where and how it is used or what other kanji it is combined with. I spent many hours sitting in my dad's lap, finger tracing under the words as he read, trying desperately to associate the symbols with specific sounds. It was about this time that I began to suspect that being reborn had changed me. I doubt very much I would have ever been able to succeed at this before. I had been smart before, yes, but never to this degree. I think that this was another instance of my body affecting my actions. Simply, the brain I was using could compute so much faster than the one I used to have. It was a little disconcerting. It made sense. Yes, the mind wasn't a spiritual entity tenuously tied to the body, it was formed by thousands of interconnecting neurons in the brain, which somehow or other lead to the higher consciousness we call the mind. Realistically, it made perfect sense. That didn't mean it wasn't unnerving. In the end, I accepted it as something useful that would help me here. Once I could read, it was like the whole world opened up for me. My parents must have thought I loved history, with the fervor that I read the books. To be fair, it was fairly interesting, especially given how short it was. History in my world could be measured back tens of thousands of years, not even considering archaeology, which could trace back several million years. Here, records were sparse before the formation of villages and practically non-existent before the Sage of the Six Paths. But I was researching. I wanted to know about this world. I wanted to know if it matched with the show, however ludicrous the idea seemed. I read, struggling through children's books, then ever-increasing books of difficulty. I wrote notes. I drew up timelines that were a mess of connections between this event and that. I began to understand. I also took note of any techniques mentioned, either basic or advanced, to look up later. To find out what was possible and what was exaggerated. Sometimes it seemed that everything was possible. History, especially shinobi history, wasn't really something that there are many books on. It probably had something to do with the secretive nature of shinobi. Likely there were many classified events that would fill in the holes of my timeline. What I did find out was clearly written with propaganda in mind. It took many months, and of course it was interspersed with other activities. I couldn't devote all my time to it, even had I been able to force myself to focus for so long. In that time, I also developed an interest in codes and ciphers. The ones available in the library were so low level that a ninja would laugh at them, but the puzzle to them caught my attention immediately. Also, the thought of being able to write secret notes, but I was far too impatient for that to be a true goal, as I knew it would take years to create a code safe enough to trust even the basest of secrets to it. There were fantasy books and adventure books in the series, Ranko the Rogue Ninja, which was funny, entertaining, informative, and just a little disturbing, if you looked closely. But it did prove, to me, that this world was as similar to the show as I could manage to remember. Which lead to the conundrum: what was I going to do now? If, as it seemed, this world was the Naruto verse, then I knew the future, or some of it. Was there anything I could do? The answer appeared to be a staggering no. Who would believe a warning from a child? I had no method of giving warning in secret, nor would I be confident in my ability to do so. I most definitely didn't want to see what they would do to me if I came out and said I remembered a previous life. A mental institution would be the nicest of several unpleasant outcomes. What were the big events? The important ones. The invasion of Konoha. The Akatsuki. Pain's attack. The Fourth Shinobi War. Could I stop those? Realistically, the Fourth Shinobi War was caused by Madara and Kabuto. If they were removed, maybe they could be taken out before it got to that stage. The same with Pain. Orochimaru's invasion. I had no clue. I needed to be strong. It wasn't an impossible goal. After all, at 15, Sasuke had killed Deidara and Itachi. Gaara had been strong enough, without the Aikibi, to be general commander of the shinobi army and take out several past Kage. Shikamaru had taken out Hidan's rank. Didn't mean unstoppable. It was possible, but it was going to take a hell of a lot of work to get me there. I couldn't do it alone, I knew that without a doubt. But getting the others to trust me, when I couldn't tell them why, that would be tricky. But apart from that daunting goal, those first years of my new life were pleasant. The only time I recall the shinobi world intruding on my quiet life was when I was, maybe a year and a half old, maybe two, and Shikaku came back from a mission with 2 livid scars across the side of his face. He was rather lucky, one arched above his eyebrow, the other curved below his cheekbone, both missed his eye. A missing eye wasn't an insurmountable problem for a skilled ninja, but no one would argue that it was a problem. He hadn't been gone for that long, but the scars were mostly healed, just a livid red. Either base healing rates were faster here, or they had been chakra healed. Maybe a mixture of both. I think he was a little worried about how we would react to them. Yoshino didn't react to them, other than to maybe hug him a little harder than normal. Maybe she thought, close call. We, on the other hand, were too young to really understand, and they did make him look rather fierce. And maybe he could be, but I'd never known him as anything other than kind and gentle. Daddy, I burbled, carefully running my pudgy toddler hands over them. Carefully, because my motor coordination wasn't that great and I didn't want to poke him in the eye. I don't know what I would have said, but my language facilities weren't very well developed at that stage, anyway. Shikamaru pretty much just yawned and fell asleep, but that's his reaction to anything. Shikamaru was a complete sloth, but cuddly in the way all young children are. It was lucky I had no desire to play the run-around games children play, because trying to motivate him into playing would have taken twice as long as the game itself. Yoshino, Mum, was rather ecstatic to have a daughter. She seemed to delight in dressing me up and braiding my hair. I didn't mind over much. She had good taste and chose mainly darker colors, blues and greens and reds, that complemented my dark hair and fair skin. Of course, I usually stole a pair of Shikamaru's trousers to wear under my dress, at which she would roll her eyes. The fashion of the place was strange to my tastes, though I grew used to it. Wearing mesh next to your skin sounds, on the surface, like a painfully bad idea. However, It was surprisingly comfortable. It looked like it was made of thick wire, but in reality it was thin, strong wire wrapped in black fabric. This served two purposes: one to stop the wire shining, and two, so that you didn't get cheese grater skin. Some shirts also came with underlay fabric, either in black or. I didn't particularly like the 3/4 length pants, nor the habit of bandaging them to your ankles, but I had to admit that it was a practical way to keep them from flapping about, even if it did make your thighs look like balloons. I didn't like the open-toed ninja sandals, either, but I resolved to grow used to them, because, again, they were practical. They had wide soles and deep grooves to provide plenty of grip on practically any surface, and high tops to brace ankles. The open toes were designed to stop sweating, though they did little to keep your toes warm. I was grateful that Fire Country had mild weather. The fact that they were horrendously ugly simply had to be ignored. I missed the elegance of high heels, but seeing as how Konoha hadn't seemed to have heard of concrete paving, it was probably for the best. Something I noticed about my parents, even in those early years, was that they were silent when they walked. I mean, they tried to make noise when coming into a room, or walking up behind us, but for them, it was a conscious thing, something they had to pay attention to do. I had no idea how they did it. It was half technique, half simply the way they walked. I tried to mimic Yoshino as best I could. Shikaku was simply too good, whatever method he used obscured by his habitual lazy slouch. I toddled after Yoshino, stepping as lightly and precisely as I could. Shikaku found the whole thing amusing. My little cat foot, he would chortle, swinging me up. Later on, I'd learn the chakra half of the cat's foot technique, but even without it I could move near silently on most surfaces. With it, sometimes I felt more like a ghost than a child. We weren't trained at that age, though many of the games we played seemed to have underlying meaning. There were several I was already familiar with, cat's cradle and clapping games, but also many more that seemed aimed at developing limber fingers and good hand-eye coordination. Yoshino also dragged us through a warm-up stretching routine in the morning, ever since we were old enough to stand on our own. I likened it to yoga, moving from pose to pose in a natural progression. It was quite astounding just how flexible and supple we were. Some of those poses I could have never done in my old body. Then, I hadn't been able to touch my fingertips to the floor without bending my knees. Here I could lay my entire palms flat, forwards and backwards. The routine we were taught was one that was clearly meant to be taught to children, as it came with a song to help remember the order of the poses. Of course, trying to do all that and sing. It isn't as easy as it sounds. Actually, now that I think about it, the song is a little creepy, too. I guess that's what you get in a ninja society. It wasn't all solitude, though. Parents here thought nothing of letting their kids run through the streets. The towering, ramshackle buildings and narrow alleyways made for the perfect setting for games of chase and hide and seek, or as they were called locally, games of ninja. I can't say I particularly enjoyed those times. My peers found me quite strange. It was something I could decrease over time, but the sheer deliberateness of having to relearn how to interact with others instead of simply knowing how to be sociable set me apart. You could argue that I should have been better at it, having a lifetime of experience, but I had never been particularly social and I was far out of my comfort zone. All the rules I had learned collapsed around me like a house of cards. Kids don't talk about the weather or care about the rising price of X. There was no TV, no shows, no music. Konoha didn't have a national sport that everyone followed. We didn't yet attend school, so I didn't even have that to talk about. Most of them couldn't yet read. I was completely lost. I watched and I listened more than I spoke, tagged along after Shikamaru like a particularly intelligent shadow, and didn't speak unless prompted or unless I was absolutely sure what I was saying would be understood and accepted. There is nothing worse than having everyone around you laughing at you. I can still feel the humiliation burning. Maybe I should have had thicker skin, but even as an adult, a group of children laughing at me would have still set me near to tears. It was one of these games, where we met Choji. Everyone thinks that because our parents are friends, that's how we met. But it isn't true. Our parents are smarter than that. They know that it's the friends you chose yourself that last through your whole life. You can't play ninja with us anymore. Yubir and Suzu protested, when Choji asked to join the game. There were only about a dozen of us, but he had established himself as the leader of the game. The blocky purple tattoos on his cheeks identified him as a member of the Suzu clan. As a clan, they very rarely became combat ninja, but focused more on medical ninjutsu. They were also known as being good musicians, particularly with their namesake singing bowls. The tattoos looked familiar, and I wondered if I should know of someone with those markings. Then it hit me. Rin. Kakashi's teammate Rin. The medic who had transplanted his eye. She had had those markings too. Uneasily, I wondered if she had chosen a combat role, or if the war had demanded it from her of necessity. But why can't I? Shuige asked plaintively. Because whenever you play with us, we lose. Yubirin retorted. Yeah, you're way too slow, chimed his best friend, hanger-on, Jiro Watanabe. Choji looked heartbroken. You know guys, Shikamaru said. Without him, the teams aren't going to be even. It'd be lame, like if you played a game of shogi with one piece missing. That was my brother, I thought with fondness. He looked out for people. Choji looked so happy at his intervention, but the next line sent his expression crashing again. But if you have one piece that's totally useless, it's the same thing. Yeah, what he said, Jiro echoed. It's our team, and we don't mind having one less person. I swallowed. We could swap, I offered. He could be on this team. Shika looked at me in surprise, whether it offer itself or the mere fact that I'd spoken up in public. He knew how awkward I felt trying to talk to people. Yubirin scoffed. You're a girl. We don't want a girl on our team. So let's just play. Well, if it's okay with you, then I guess it's fine, one of the others muttered, casting an impatient look around. They didn't care who played, as long as we started. Okay. Then it's settled. Yubirin beamed, pleased at having won the argument. We're so going to win this time. Choji lowered his head and walked off, dragging his feet. Out of the corner of my eye I saw him stop to free a butterfly from a spider's web. Why don't you keep playing? Shikamaru suggested, watching the path of the butterfly as it fluttered away. I'll be right back. I hesitated, caught between the desire to follow him and follow his suggestion. If Shika wasn't here, then I had no real reason, nor desire, to keep playing. On the other hand, if he was going to go and follow Choji, it'd probably go better if I wasn't there. After all, they had been the best of friends. I'd never forgive myself if I disrupted that. I bit my lip, and turned back to the game. Shika wasn't. Right back. The game ended and the children dispersed, so in the end I decided to go looking for him. It wasn't hard to find his chakra, but even without it, I would have been able to find him. He was at his favorite cloud watching spot, after all. I cautiously made my way up the stairs, to see Shika and Choji lying down on the large bench. There was a man there that had to be Choji's father, watching the two of them with amused fondness. I hovered, unsure whether to intrude or retreat back downstairs, when Shikamaru looked up and beckoned me over. This is my sister, he said to Choji, before adding. She's troublesome, but I've gotta look out for her. I flushed, embarrassed, and looked down at the ground. Way to make a first impression. I didn't take offense though, because Shikamaru found just about everything troublesome. Hi. Hi, Choji parroted back, equally shyly, before holding out his snacks. Would you like a chip? And thus, friendship was born. I can't say I was as close to him as Shika was, the two of them just seemed to click. But I hung around with them almost constantly, and neither of them ever made me feel unwanted or excluded. For that, I think, I will always count him as one of my closest of friends. It was shortly after that we were due to start school. The academy at age 5, normally, but they weren't very strict on entrance requirements. Genius children started and graduated a lot earlier, as young as deemed necessary, though they were beginning to tighten those regulations. The war with Cloud had reacted a sort of stalemate, or Cold War. There was definite tension, but we were no longer actively fighting. People were beginning to cautiously hope for peace. And that meant that they could spend a lot longer training their children. I had taken it for granted that Shikamaru and I would be attending together. It wasn't that I particularly wanted to be a ninja, though I have to admit, I wasn't immune to the lure of it, because my family was a ninja family, but Shika and I were a unit, we went everywhere together. It simply didn't occur to me that this would be any different. Shikako, honey, Mum said one morning after I'd finished helping her with the breakfast dishes. To be honest, I rather liked helping her out in the kitchen. I'd never been a good cook before, and that was with meals and appliances designed for speed and convenience. Learning my way around a kitchen was something I wanted to do before it became absolutely necessary. Why don't you stay here for a moment, so we can go down to Shogako to fill in your enrollment? Shogako. I repeated, blindsided. Shogako. The civilian elementary school. It was very, very rare for a Nara to go there. Even those of the clan that didn't go on to be ninja usually went through the academy. I'm not going to the academy. Oh, sweetheart, she said, face softening, and sat me down at the table. Then she explained, very clearly, about how, when I had been a child, they had taken me to the hospital, and I had been diagnosed as chakra hypersensitive. It meant, she went on, that I would never be able to use chakra and never be able to be a ninja. This was the first I had heard of it, and it confused the hell out of me. I had been using chakra. I knew I had been using chakra. Nothing as obvious as a jutsu. I didn't have enough chakra for that, but I could stick myself to surfaces, and could form chakra strings and light, as well as a dozen other chakra control exercises I had run across in my reading or invented. But, Shika is going, I said, bewildered at this information, grasping the first point of argument that I came across. It took me a little while to order my thoughts, as it occurred to me that what I knew and what others knew weren't the same. There was an inconsistency between my internal world and the external world. It shook me, probably more than it should have. I know, Mum sympathized. But you're a big girl now. Won't it be nice to make friends without your brother hanging around? It occurred to me that I was being offered a perfect out from the danger of being a ninja. It was tempting. Even if I had decided before that I was going to do something about the disasters I knew were coming, it was tempting. But, Shika was my brother. Choji was my friend. I knew the Konoha 12 as characters in a story, but I still liked them. I couldn't just abandon them. I couldn't just do nothing. I want to go to the academy, I said firmly, possibly the first time in my life. This time, anyway, I'd made a declarative statement. Mum looked horribly surprised. Shikako. She sighed. You won't be able to learn what they're teaching. You won't be able to graduate. I want to go. Please. I swallowed. I'll work really hard and learn everything else, even if I can't use chakra. I was pretty sure I could, but she had started a niggling doubt. Maybe what I had been doing was different. Maybe. All right, she said, finally. I'll talk to your father when he gets home and see what he thinks. It wasn't a, yes, you can go, but close to it. Dad very much went with the flow, unless he had a very good reason not to. The Ninja Academy covered every topic that the civilian one did, and more besides, so there was no real argument that it would be better for me, except that I would never be able to graduate. Possibly, they were also concerned that being unable to use chakra wouldn't do a heck of a lot for my self-esteem, but ninja didn't really believe in coddling their children. Most of them were of the belief that a few hard knocks and they'll work out what they're doing wrong. I wandered outside to find Shika and Choji, confused and surprisingly upset. Shika was watching clouds, as usual, and I lay down beside him and curled up into his side. Something wrong? He asked after a moment. I sniffed, and considered not telling him, but couldn't see why not to. He'd probably find out tonight anyway, and he might be able to come up with more arguments to convince our parents. I might not be going to the academy with you, I said. What? Choji exclaimed, dropping his bag of chips. Why not? They don't think I can use chakra, I said, wrinkling my nose. One of the medics at the hospital apparently diagnosed me as hypersensitive when I was a baby. Shikamaru rolled the new information around in his head. But you can, he pointed out, frowning. I've seen you do that light thing. I nodded. After a nightmare I would sometimes creep out of my room and into his. After a few nights of walking into things, I'd managed to learn how to call up chakra to my hands for illumination. I hadn't realized he knew that, though. Did you tell them that? I blinked, then sighed. No, I offered. Stupid. Now there was a simple solution. I was so stupid. I had been avoiding showing off my skills for fear of being labeled a prodigy, something I most definitely did not want or need, but I could have told them that. All right, I said, resolved. If it came up, I'd show them. I'd rather be a prodigy than excluded. But it didn't come to that. As I predicted, Dad had no argument against me going to the academy with Shikamaru. That was how we came to be signed up to start the academy at the end of summer. Against danger it pays to be prepared. Aesop, the night before we started the academy I didn't sleep that well. It might be more accurate to say that I had a nightmare, probably brought on by the nervousness and anticipation I felt. Of red chakra and pure terror and the helplessness of being blind and dumb. I woke silently, the gasp never leaving my lips, eyes flaring wide and darting about my room. For a second, I thought there was someone standing in the corner. But no, there was no one there. My chakra sense told me the only people in the house was me, my brother, and my parents. The human brain was good at facial recognition. Too good sometimes, because it found faces in other things, shadows as a prime example. It was particularly common during hypnagogia, or waking sleep. Funnily enough, that didn't really reassure me. I gathered chakra to my hands. If you get a great enough concentration of it, chakra can become visible. Something like the Rasengan, where it was not only visible but almost solid, took a huge amount, more than I currently had, but I could manage a kind of ghostly light easily enough. I called it up, and held my hands out, reassuring myself that there was no one there. It was bright enough to see by, flickering off the floor and walls. I breathed, shakily, and slid my legs off my bed, flinching at the thought of something shooting out from underneath it to grab me. Nothing happened. Just a nightmare, I told myself. There is nothing here. The house was so silent. I could hear wind rustling through trees, the faint call of the deer, creaking of floorboards. I stood and crept forward, my footsteps making no sound at all, lighting my way with my hands held outstretched. Shikamaru's room was right next to mine. His door was ajar, and I didn't even have to move it to slink into his room. In the preternatural quiet of the house, his breathing was loud and reassuring. I felt the tension drain out of my back. As a Nara, I shouldn't be afraid of the dark. It was where we were strongest. But I didn't like to be alone in it. I paused in the middle of his room, until some sense told him he wasn't alone, and he stirred, squinting at me with bleary eyes, then shuffled over. That was as much an invitation as I was going to get. I doused my light and slid into bed. I didn't fall asleep for a long while, but eventually, between one blink and the next, I fell into slumber. Rise and shine. Up, you two. Someone shrieked at some ungodly hour of the morning. I reached for a pillow to pull over my head, only to find it had been taken, along with all the blankets. Blearily, I looked up, to find Mum holding the aforementioned items. Oh well, it wasn't that cold. I curled up, bumping into Shikamaru, who had the same idea. Oh, no you don't, she said firmly. Get up. It's your first day at the academy, you are not going to be late. Several moments later, I stumbled into my room and attempted to get dressed, having to repeat the process several times as some items found themselves inside out or back to front. But I managed it, and just in time too. If you two aren't down here in the next 3 seconds. Mum threatened. I stumbled out of my room, nearly crashing into Shikamaru, and we slouched downstairs. She hustled us into the backyard. Wait, we were still going to do our stretches. I'd have rather had an extra half hour of sleep. Judging by his face, Shikamaru felt the same. But we were both too wise to voice that thought. I woke up in the morning and saw the mountain there. Mum started, voice ringing out clearly, as she reached straight upwards, back tensing, then pulled her arms down in a wide circle. We copied her, and my voice joined in the song as a hoarse mumble. We'd been doing this sequence for years. It had started short, but grown longer and longer as more verses were added. It took us about half an hour to do, now, which was frankly a crazy amount of time. I could recall many days where I'd done nowhere near that amount of exercise, let alone that amount as a warm-up. Granted, it did do wonders for waking you up. By the time we got to, I could have been a solider, or a dancer, or a tree. I could have been a farmer, or a merchant, or a queen, the moves for which were actually quite fun. I was most definitely awake. After we had finished, we went inside and ate breakfast before getting cleaned up. By this time, it was starting to get to a respectable hour to be awake, and it was nearly time for us to leave for the academy. It was a fair distance to travel from our house, after all. The Ninja Academy, surprisingly enough, was located next to the mountain in the same building as the Hokage's office and mission assignment desk. It seemed somewhat counterintuitive to have so many young and noisy children next to such a serious work environment, until one realized that it was perhaps the most defensible location in the entire village. In fact, the only safer places were inside the mountain itself. The fact that I even realized that meant that I was far more affected by my new world than I had anticipated. When we got to the academy, they had a small introduction ceremony for us. Both Mum and Dad came to watch and sent us off to sit with the other children with an admonished, "Be good." The third Hokage was there, and he spoke at length about learning and doing well and forging friendships and holding on to the will of fire. It was actually a very inspirational speech, but I spent most of it surreptitiously looking over my classmates trying to spot the rookie 9. Everyone was so small. Family law. It surprised me a bit at how many children there were here. I'd kinda had the impression that there was only one class per year. That wasn't true. There were more like 5 or 6. I guess that makes sense, when you think that not all individuals would last to graduation, and not all those would pass. There had to be more than 3 teams refilling the shinobi ranks every year, or the ninja population would decline very, very fast. 2 teachers called out a class list and led their new classes away before Iruka-sensei took to the stage. He looked so very young and awkward. Right. With me are Aburame, Shino. I listened closely, hoping I was in the same class as Shikamaru. I hadn't even given it a thought that we might be separated, that I wouldn't be with Rookie 9. Nara. Shikako, Nara Shikamaru. I gave a slight smile to Shika, happy we were together. He nodded, and got up to slouch over to where the others were waiting. I could pick out Shino, the first one to be called, and Choji, obviously. Hinata was easy to see, with her shy demeanor even if her bloodline didn't give her away. Sakura was also blindingly obvious with her bright pink hair, though she looked to be just as shy as Hinata. Uzumaki, Naruto, Iruka-sensei's voice hitched, just slightly. And Yamanaka, Ino, thank you. Please follow me. He led us away, and I looked over my shoulder, to see Mum and Dad wave us goodbye. Several of the parents around them were shuffling uneasily. I had my suspicions as to why. The classroom we were led to was surprisingly large. There were huge windows set into the far wall, to let in natural light and provide an escape route. Even though Konoha had many things in common with Japan, where houses were small and compact, Ninja did not like being in confined spaces, leading to buildings that were larger and more spacious than you would expect. The classroom had benches arranged in rows, each slightly higher than the last, auditorium style. The front had a large black board and there was a teacher's desk slightly to the side. There were several bland educational posters spread over the walls to try and interject a bit of life into the classroom. I slouched down next to Shika in one of the back benches. In my old world, sitting at the back of the class was usually a sign of uninterested students. Here, it meant that there was no one behind us, which was the mark of a good ninja. It's strange how perspective changes things. It took far longer than it should for the rest of the class to get seated, but that's how working with kids goes, I guess. I watched with half-lidded eyes as the other students sized each other up and Aruka vainly tried to keep order. Most of the morning was spent with the minute of first day at school, assigning textbooks, making sure everyone had the appropriate stationery, listing the rules and expectations, and making name badges so we could all get to know each other. All perfectly normal first day things that I had gone through more than a dozen times before. It disillusioned me quite rapidly to the fact that this might be ninja school, but it was still school. Oh, joy. It wasn't that I didn't like school, it was just, well, you've got to be slightly reluctant to go. Some kids were paying diligent attention to Aruka-sensei, Sakura, Hinata, Shino, while several more had zoned out. Shika was sleeping and Choji was eating, and I could predict that very soon Kiba and Naruto were going to start causing disruptions. Luckily, this was the point where the bell for the lunch rang. Alright, kids, Aruka-sensei half yelled over the sudden explosion of noise. You have 1 hour. I want you all back here when the bell rings. I poked Shikamaru awake and we both wandered outside, Choji trailing after Shikamaru, munching on some chips. Only the last year students were allowed to leave the academy grounds, so we found an empty patch of grass surrounding the main field to eat our lunch. Thoughts? I asked, idly watching the rest of the children find places to sit and eat. Some alone, some in groups. Some of them appeared to know each other, while others were awkward with new friendships. Lunch was divided into year levels, so all the children who had started today were here. The other classes would have lunch at different times. There was Shino, sitting alone by the trees. There was Hinata. And there was Naruto. There were numerous problems with the third Hokage's secrecy laws. How everyone had known about it in the first place. Group mentality had shown that the ideals of the group persisted long after any founding member's hand left, or the true reasons for the behavior had been forgotten. It was like the old story with the monkeys pulling each other off the ladder. Not knowing why they were treating Naruto badly wouldn't mean they didn't. The Gaara situation only became so bad because people kept trying to assassinate him. His instinctive knowledge of moving sand hadn't helped matters, but he hadn't been homicidal before that. Perhaps it wasn't anything to do with the way people treated him, but to keep Naruto himself from finding out. Uzumaki Mito had invented the Kyuubi seal and she had used it on herself. The seal had been created for a willing vessel, unlike the other Jinchuriki in which the vessel was as trapped as the Biju. I knew he could remove the seal himself and release Kyuubi. Did you want a child knowing that? That all it would take to get back at people would be to remove a tiny piece of paper from a cage. The temptation would be huge. Did Gaara's seal have that option? I don't know. Clearly his seal worked differently, allowing the use of sand and partial transformations and releases as it did. Naruto didn't have that option. Other than his healing, He gained no tangible powers. It was certainly something to think about. But I have to admit, Naruto at this age wasn't what I had unconsciously been expecting. He was young, and quiet and a little sullen. He was easy to overlook. It was very different from the genin that he was in the show. I guess that was the point. Troublesome, Shikamaru declared after a long silence. I like Iruka-sensei, Choji offered, in between mouthfuls. I nodded in agreement. He seems nice. There was an explosion of noise, as kids began congregating in the middle of the field. They'd finished their lunch and were starting a game of ninja. Choji perked up. Can we go play? He asked eagerly. I looked at Shika, who shrugged. Sure. Neither of us were particularly enthusiastic at the idea, but hey, if Choji wanted to. We wandered over there, to find our old friend directing the game. I told you, he can't play anymore. Yubirin said, annoyed, when we asked to join in. Choji slumped, dejected. Shika and I exchanged glances. So troublesome, Shikamaru said. Never mind, guys, Choji said. I'll just go. I shook my head. We can play our own game, I offered. Yubirin sneered, there's 3 of you. I'm sure that'll be fun. I scowled at him, and he seemed quite taken back. So did Choji, come to think of it. But then I spied an unmistakable blonde head, hovering sadly at the sidelines. Naruto was watching the game. Likely, they hadn't let him play either. I nudged Shikamaru. But 4 of us will be, he drawled, easily catching on, before strolling past Yubirin. Choji and I followed easily. It was strange that we had made Shikamaru our leader, given that he would rather cloud watch than play, but since neither Choji or I could, he had taken the spot by default. There was a gasp from behind us. You're going to play with him. Our parents told us to stay away from him. We ignored it. Naruto, peering through his bangs, watched us approach with a mixture of sullen hope and distrust. So, Shika said, slouching to a stop. Did you want to play ninja with us? Martial arts. The look of joy on his face was kind of heartbreaking. The rule goes, if you have one person staring at a spot on the pavement, you're a weirdo. If you have 2 people, there must be something interesting, and others will stop to see what you're looking at. In that vein, as we started playing, more and more people joined in. We had quite a game going by the time the end of lunch bell rang. Both Choji and Naruto were practically shinning with joy. After lunch we had Taijutsu class, aka PE, the class one had despised above all others before, and one that seemed highly necessary this time. Being a ninja involved a heck of a lot of running and jumping, even if I never specialized in taijutsu. Which meant I was just going to have to suck it up and try. It went worse than I had feared. I was actually a little baffled at how badly it went. Speed and stamina wise, I was only slightly above Shika, who wasn't even trying. He managed a lazy shuffling jog for about 3 steps before Iruka-sensei went to glare at somebody else. I wasn't exactly surprised at coming last. I'd developed sports day-itis on many occasions in order to avoid compulsory athletics days at school because I always came in last at everything, but I was a little surprised at how far behind I was. It was a little embarrassing, to be honest. It certainly put a damper on my wonder and anticipation. It's one thing to know that being a ninja is hard work, it's another to have your arms and legs burning on the 10th lap of the grounds when you still have another 10 to go. In a world with no cars, this was how ninja got around. Running. Oh, joy. And after running, there was stretching, and sit-ups and press-ups and an obstacle course, there were slalom pulls and games of catch. We were too young to be trusted with actual kunai yet, even blunt or wooden ones, but we were practicing throwing all the same. It was incredibly tempting to give up. It was hard to motivate myself. Admittedly, I had never been particularly hard-working before, either. I hadn't been a genius, but I had been smart enough to pick up on things easier than my peers, allowing me to cruise through school with hardly any effort at all. Physical prowess had never mattered before, and I found that I was incredibly unprepared for it to count. I admit, I started to have serious doubts about my future as a ninja right about then. It was a little disheartening. Certainly it was very humbling. Maybe, I had been harboring a small hope that I could be brilliant. I could be strong. I had died young, longer than most ninja were wont to live, probably, but still less than a third of my lifespan, according to the measures of the world. I was close with my parents and siblings, proud of my university degree and content with my job, but there had been nothing about my life that 10-year-old me would have looked at and said, "That's what I want to be." 10-year-old me had wanted glory and fame and greatness. I had been no one special. Maybe, I wanted that once more. It was silly to think that the path of a ninja would give that to me. Too much fan fiction, I guess, not enough attention paid to the cannon fodder characters. I had the sneaking suspicion that that was what I was. But, well, it would be pretty pathetic to give up after just one class. Thankfully, that was the last class of the day. Uruka-sensei let us go with a half smile and a relieved look, and everyone seemed to gain another burst of energy as they left the classroom. Even Shika looked awake. Man, that was so boring. Kiba exclaimed, barreling down the hallway. Freedom. Troublesome, Shika sighed, as a teacher poked their head out of a doorway to yell at him for running inside. It wasn't that bad, Choji offered, pulling out a bag of chips. Med. We met Naruto. Said boy perked up at the sound of his name and looked over at us. Outside the academy building there was a crowd of parents mingling and waiting to pick kids up from their first day at school. I noticed quite a few look at Naruto, before shuffling their kids away from him. It wasn't quite a glare, but it was definitely not friendly. He noticed it too, and glared at the ground. There's Dad, Shika said, bumping my shoulder and slouching off towards him. I hesitated, then turned to Naruto. See you tomorrow, I said lamely. His returning smile was brilliant. Yeah, we can play ninja again, right? I nodded, and ambled off. Dad had most definitely seen our conversation, but I couldn't tell what he was thinking. He didn't say anything about it immediately though, swinging me up on his shoulders and Shikamaru on his back. Trying to walk us home would take probably 5 times longer than carrying us, since I was tired and achy, and Shikamaru's normal speed of movement was approximately a crawl. How was school? He drawled. Troublesome, Shika answered. I giggled. It was just such a typical answer. It was fine, I said. Uruka-sensei is nice. And we met some new people. So I saw, Dad said softly. Like that blonde kid you were talking to. He raised his voice. I nodded, even though he couldn't see it. His name is Naruto. He's okay. Do you know, people treat him weird. I changed my sentence midway through. I didn't want to give away too much. He didn't react. He was far too good a ninja for that. But I think he was still a little surprised, more that we had brought it up than that we had noticed. You should do what you think is right, Shikaku said. I'd like to have said that I would continue trying, even if he'd forbidden me, but I don't know if I could have. I disliked disappointing people, particularly my parents. But they were big on letting us think for ourselves. We made our own choices, and our own mistakes. I pondered. What does Daddy think is the right thing? I asked. It struck me then that people weren't afraid of Naruto per se, but of him letting the Kyuubi out. Some people must have known that Kushina was the vessel. It can't have been an absolute secret, not in a village of ninja. But if the weakened seal during birth was a secret, that meant they had no idea why the Kyuubi had gotten loose. The third was in a lose-lose situation. Knowledge of the weakened seal would endanger the Jinchuriki and cause panic, but if he didn't say, then people could only wonder why. She had been too close to Konoha to have been killed in battle. which left the assumption that she had let it out willingly. And if Kushina had, a fully grown, capable shinobi, then a child, would he do the same? Of course, Jinchuriki got a bad rap. Whether it was undeserved or not, caused or not, it was still fact that many of them were homicidal and unstable. Keeping your distance from someone like that was just common sense. And telling your children to, doubly more so. Why do you ask? Because daddy knows things I don't, I answered, not missing the fact that he had dodged the question. He chuckled. Daddy knows many things you don't. What do you think of him? I petted his hair absently. The way it stuck up made me assume that it was coarse and harsh, but it was surprisingly soft. He's annoying, I said truthfully. But so is Kiba, and no one tells us to stay away from him. He chuckled, maybe recognizing the name. I wouldn't be surprised if he did. Do you know who Naruto's parents are? I asked. He didn't tense, he was too good for that, but there was a careful note to his voice that I would have missed if I hadn't been listening for it. Why do you ask? Because you're old, I said promptly, well aware that that wasn't what he was asking. And because everyone says to Shikamaru, I sighed heavily and theatrically. You're just like your father. Then they leave him alone, because they know you're awesome. I nodded. So did Naruto's parents do something bad? I knew Shikamaru was awake, but he opened his eyes for that. I probably should have felt bad about putting him on the spot like that, but I didn't. No one knows who his parents are, Shikaku said carefully. But he has a last name, I objected. Some orphans didn't. Case in point, Tenten. How hard could it be to go Uzumaki? It could be an honorary name, Shikaku said. After someone who died the day he was born. Translation. He could have been called Uzumaki because he was the vessel, not the vessel because he was an Uzumaki. Which, actually, was perfectly plausible. If people hadn't known that she was pregnant at the time, I suspect people didn't like to think of it. I hemmed thoughtfully and let the topic drop. It was, after all, a conversational minefield. It had certainly given me things to think about. That was really all it took to befriend Naruto, a game and a goodbye. In the morning, as Iruka-sensei tried to bring the class to order, he approached us hesitantly with wary hope in his eyes. I had no idea how many times people had become distant from him after their parents had had a word with him, but as far as I could see, he was canon Naruto. He wasn't dangerous. I kicked out the chair next to me and his face lit up with such joy that it almost hurt to look at. Childhood is fleeting. ... In addition to attending the academy, I was also signed up for special, kunoichi classes. These started a week after the academy did and took place after the regular academy hours, so were technically more of a club than a class. They weren't mandatory, but all the girls were strongly encouraged to attend. I think the only one who didn't from our year was Hinata, probably on the basis that it wasn't appropriate for a Hyuga, or that she had her own, better tutors on the subject. On the surface the classes were reasonably innocuous. We learned about festivals and holidays of the major lands, we learned ikebana and basic cooking. We learned sewing and embroidery. We learned tea ceremonies and how to apply makeup and wear formal kimono. We learned instruments. All typical, girlish things. They were all also things that would aid us with infiltration. We were taught how to sing and how to act and how to dance. It was extremely thorough training and none of the other girls even realized it. Ikebana taught us which flowers were poisonous and where they were found and how to arrange a bouquet to look beautiful while hiding death inside. It taught us how to pass coded messages to each other, hidden in flower meanings. We could imitate geisha or high-born ladies. We could pretend to be natives to any country of the elemental nations. We were taught how to draw, to sketch the face of people we needed to identify, to hide messages within images to get them past scrutiny. This was where I met Sakura and Ino. The first day was difficult. Shika and Choji weren't there, and I didn't know any of the other girls. It's probably a little sad to admit that I used a child as a shield, even disregarding that I was a child myself. But Shikamaru was good at it, with his nonchalant, I don't care, attitude, where I seemed to take everything too personally. He was my buffer to the world. When Suzume-sensei told us to go and gather some flowers, I stood awkwardly to the side. I felt shy, terrified of trying to introduce myself when, it seemed, everyone had naturally fallen into groups already. I was lost. Then I noticed Sakura. Her pink hair should have stood out horribly, but it blended remarkably well. She was alone, diligently picking flowers, as we had been told. I licked my lips nervously and headed towards her. But someone got there before me. I couldn't see what Amy said, but I definitely saw Ino's throw. A takedown with flowers. It was a wonder that Ino didn't specialize in thrown weapons. That was a good throw, I said, approaching Ino and Sakura, hands fiddling with my flowers. Several of them were bringing to look mangled. It shouldn't be so hard to approach two young girls. But it was. Ino beamed at the compliment. Thank you. She deserved it. I'm Ino, and this is Sakura. Shikako, I replied, relieved that she was being so friendly. God, how pathetic could I get? I said when the silence stretched. What flowers do you have? I could only find these. Flowers were nowhere near my best subject, and it wasn't like we had really started learning anyway. I doubted anything important would be covered in the first week or so. Half of what I was holding was probably weeds. But I should have remembered that Ino's parents ran a flower shop, because she picked up the conversation easily, chattering along and helping Sakura and I with our selections. And that was pretty much that. Ino was an incredibly gregarious girl. She seemed to know everyone. And had absolutely no compunctions about sharing what she knew, either. It was with her that I discovered people watching. Shikamaru could keep his clouds. This was interesting. I wanted to know how people interacted. I wanted to know who got on well with who. I wanted to know who did well in which class and which skill and why. I wanted to know who had shinobi parents and how much of their skills that explained. Apparently, this was something that was normal. I was a girl. I gossiped. It was something of a revelation. I still wasn't particularly sociable, preferring to watch others than interact with them, but a small group of friends was better than nothing. Ino and Sakura and I still hung out with Shika and Choji, and Naruto was there constantly. He was exhausting. Not just physically, which he was, always running and playing, but socially exhausting. I wasn't really used to dealing with anyone other than Shika for long periods of time, and Naruto couldn't be more different. We ended up recruiting Kiba as the only other student with near as much energy, just to keep him occupied. Naruto was annoying. He wasn't abused or treated badly. People didn't really even glare that much. To them, he was just there, as unimportant as the trees by the side of the road. He was the epitome of somebody else's problem. Most children are, and that somebody else is their parent. Naruto didn't have parents, and the orphanage caregivers were run so ragged with so many children they had no time for individual attention. He just wasn't important to anyone. Yeah, it might have been emotional neglect, but it wasn't done intentionally or maliciously. There was just no time. But he wanted attention. He craved it. And he would go to extreme lengths to get it. He was a brat, and knowing why didn't make it any easier to deal with. He was obnoxious and loud and insulting, and for all his desire to be a ninja never sat still to listen to anything he didn't deem cool. But it was Naruto. I knew he was going to be great, and kind and a loyal friend. If I could just deal with him, help him, teach him a little, get him to think things through, then things would be better. If I could just be his friend. I tried. There were other hiccups. Children don't all get along, and those that are different, weird, are identified immediately. It's not always malicious, but it's there. Amy, who I had met in kunoichi classes, was one that took exception to Sakura and I. We were the quiet ones, the smart ones, the ones who hung out with the boys. We didn't fit. I don't want to cast her as the stereotypical bully. She could be kind and polite. Outside of class, I once ran into her serving customers at her mother's tea shop and she was as polite to me as any other. She took her job seriously, a good trait for a ninja. Inside of school, however, there were confrontations. God, Ino, you used to be cool. Now you're picking up all the weirdos, Amy said, one lunchtime, sneering at the three of us. Ino, I knew, would be happily accepted into anyone's social circle, but chose to stay with us. Chose. Even at 6, maybe especially at 6, that's a hard choice to make, and an even harder one to stick by. I know I had, in my previous life, drifted away from friends from things much less than outright confrontation. I wish I could say I had retorted with something so witty that she ran away crying. Truthfully, as always happens, my throat locked up tightly and I was silent. Humiliation, this is thy name. I know that it wouldn't have been so bad if I had been able to reply with anything at all, but I couldn't, I've never been able to, and my silence just makes things worse. But Ino is brilliant. The only weirdo here is you, she retorted, not in the least bit cowed. She tossed her head, long blonde strands highlighting the movement. At least I have friends, all you've got is mindless sycophants. I was impressed. As insults go, it was children's level, but I've known adults that couldn't say sycophants. And Amy clearly had no idea what it meant. She turned red and stomped off, and the laughter, the dreaded laughter, followed her. Thanks, I muttered, half ashamed I couldn't even defend myself. Ino just smiled, cheerful and confident, like nothing could shake her. That's what friends are for, right, Sakura? Sakura looked as startled and afraid as I felt, eyes wide under her shaggy pink hair. But she nodded timidly. Right. And of course, classes were progressing. I was well ahead of the others in the basics, reading, writing, mathematics, history, and usually ended up bringing my own books to class to read while Aruka-sensei taught. It was a skill that any school child picked up, the ability to simultaneously pay just enough attention to know what the teacher was talking about, while aimlessly gazing out the window. I read, instead. The teachers didn't care as long as you didn't disrupt the class, which was why Shikamaru got away with sleeping through everything short of taijutsu training, when Naruto and Kiba usually ended up with 3 or 4 detentions a week between them. Even though I was well ahead in theoretical classes, I worked hard to bring myself up to par in the physical department. 6 weeks later, I was nearly on average with the other students, due to far more extra running than I ever thought I'd do, when I realized with blinding clarity that made me feel like an idiot just why I was so far behind. They were unconsciously enhancing their muscles with chakra. They could no more control it than they could their blood flow, but like blood, exercise increased the amount of it flowing in their muscles. I wasn't doing this. I was aware of my chakra in a way they weren't, consciously aware of it. When I was exercising, it was flowing exactly as it always flowed. I felt rather stupid. It was obvious in hindsight. If I focused, I could even see, feel the flows of chakra in them. It wasn't Byakugan standards, but rather like knowing I had my own chakra, like seeing the chakra in the air, it all resonated. That became my new project to work on at home. How to enhance my muscles as ninja did so easily. I could, of course, see the benefits of continuing to practice without it, however much I disliked the extra work, but the higher the base, the better my improvement would be once I added chakra. Logically, I knew that, and continued as I had been, albeit with little enthusiasm. There's not really any way to describe how it feels to channel chakra. It's like breathing. You just do it. But when you internalize it, channel it to your muscles, it's like being Superman. You want to leap tall buildings in a single bound. You want to yell, I am God. I defy the laws of physics. No wonder so many ninja are nutcases. It's a pure adrenaline rush. Nothing compares to it. It was easy to use chakra like this, to simply enhance things you could have done anyway, because chakra was part physical energy, generated by the body. They fit together naturally. On the same note, it was no wonder that chakra exhaustion was lethal. Chakra might be thought of as the extra energy that the body, and mind and spirit produced. Stuff that you didn't need to move or to breathe or to metabolize, so you could use it to do jutsu. Once that reserve was used up, you could either stop, or start taking energy from your muscles. That was chakra debt. First went the skeletal muscles, the arms and the legs. It felt like they were filled with lactic acid, too weak and shaky to contract anymore. Then, if you kept going, you started drawing energy from other muscles, ones that didn't normally fatigue, like your lungs and heart. Breathing grew difficult, your heart stopped beating. You died. We covered that very clearly at the academy, early on, along with many warnings not to try and use chakra unsupervised. I had average-sized chakra reserves, on the small side for a ninja, but normal for a kunoichi. Nara have never been exceptional in that department, but we make use of what we have cleverly. Mine may have been slightly larger than expected, since I had been practicing using it, and that does help build reserves. You could build your chakra stores, but they wouldn't keep increasing forever. Just like there was a limit to how fast you could run, or how smart you could get. Training would help push those limits, for you to reach your greatest capacity, but there was a limit. The maximum that your body could allow. Most ninja never reached that maximum. There was always a little more training they could squeeze out, a little more their chakra capacity could increase. Of course, the closer you got, the less that little bit more was. Though failing that, their control could improve a little more. I had exceptional control over my own chakra, but it wasn't just the chakra in my body that I could sense. It was everywhere. It was in the air I breathed, the food I ate, like persistent smoke. It caused me to cough whenever I paid too much attention to it, further cementing my reputation as a sickly child. Whether it was natural chakra or chakra residue from jutsu or emitted from people I didn't know, and resolved not to mess with it until I understood more. The last thing I wanted was to become a stone statue. Later on, that overdeveloped chakra sense would come in handy. I could sense the bodies of chakra that were other people, sense residue from leftover jutsu, point out chakra-enhanced traps and so forth. Any place that chakra had been used or anything that chakra had been used on was lit up like a beacon to my senses. In our first year at the academy we weren't taught about chakra, other than that it existed. As I had found out for myself, chakra reserves aren't really that large until 7 or 8 years of age. We wouldn't be taught to use chakra till our 3rd year, and it would be our last year before we were taught anything even remotely resembling a jutsu. I had run through dozens of chakra control exercises. I hadn't managed water walking, because drowning was too much a risk as a child, but many other exercises were possible. The wall walking exercise had been only the start. There were chakra strings. There was the leaf sticking, that I remembered from the show. And from leaves, I progressed to ever more brittle and fragile things. At first, my chakra had ripped through paper easily until I managed to adjust the force of its output. I had been terribly proud when I managed to stick rice paper to my hand and slowly, carefully, without rushing, fold it into a clumsy, lopsided origami crane. I had managed it without a single tear. Chakra was difficult to manipulate once it had been expelled. That was why chakra strings, like those used on puppets, took so much concentration. But it wasn't impossible, and I liked working with my chakra. This was something I could do for fun, bend it and twist it and see the outcome. One of the things we were drilled mercilessly on was hand seals. How to recognize them, how to form them, what they were most often associated with. The tiger seal, for example, has the index and middle finger held straight, and is a common end seal for many fire techniques. Useful information, yes, but hand seals were a bitch to do. I had no idea how people managed to do them so fast. My child's fingers were awkward and clumsy as I forced them into positions that were entirely unnatural. The only one I could manage with ease was snake, the clasping of both hands. Even then, in the time taken to form, hold and disengage, something just as important as the first two, a skilled shinobi could run through 3 or more seals. But there were more than enough things to keep me occupied researching. There were so many things that I wanted to know, like, what was it about shadows that let us control them, and control people with them? Shadows were only areas where sunlight didn't reach, they were nothing physical. What was it about that lack that made them special? Of course, there was much about shadows in folk law and myth, and our clan, unsurprisingly, had a great many books on the subject. Shadows have long been a part of folklore. Along with reflections and portraits, they're thought to be the soul, or part of it. The shadow is the negative double of the body, the alter ego of the soul, and sometimes an image of evil. The shadow can represent the darkness of the personal unconsciousness, the other, unfathomed side of the personality, the secret sharer. It is everything that the individual refuses to accept or understand about themselves. If not assured and integrated, it may become evil and destructive. It is for this reason that the Nara believe in self-acceptance. Our clan might be considered lazy and unmotivated to most, and we are, to a large degree, but we know ourselves. We try not to self-destruct. It's not so much as always remaining calm as knowing why you're angry and what you're prepared to do about it. Even if that, what, is, anything. It's a little terrifying, looking deep into your heart and asking, what would I do if someone hurt my brother? Not, what should I do? Or, what would I be expected to do? But actually, truthfully, all pretenses aside, what would I do? We're not always the people we like to think we are. Of course, it wasn't all school work. At home, I began to explore the clan grounds. The clan was rather large and sprawling. From the show I think I had assumed that Shikamaru's family was the entirety of the Nara clan. It wasn't. In fact, those that lived within the walls of Konoha weren't the entirety of the clan. The Nara ran many farms in Fire Country to supply the ingredients for our medicines. Farming took up a great deal of room, and Konoha proper was a walled village. There simply wasn't space. Within Konoha itself, we had a small forested area where we ran a herd of deer, as well as a few workshops that produced our medicine and research. Deer are odd creatures, at once supremely intelligent and incredibly skittish. They are very intelligent, they seem to know instinctively which plants will make them better when they are ill. Deer are pretty good at looking after themselves. They don't need a lot of attention or managing. In fact, they're the kind of animals that you can kill with kindness. Too much human attention makes them shocky. I think a lot of the Nara attitude stems from that. Acknowledging and accepting the fact that sometimes, if you just leave it alone, it'll come right on its own. Lazy, sure, but pragmatic too. It made me wonder if our clan had started our medical theory not from the deer but from observing them. There are some parts of our research that directly involved the deer though. Because male deer, the stags and the harts, shed and regrow their antlers every year, there was some serious study being done into the ways that they do this, in the hopes of adapting the principles to allow people to regrow limbs and tissues. A lot of it, however, was based on herbs and plants and the chemicals found in them, much the same as my old world. There was less synthesizing of chemicals, and I don't know that chemistry itself was as advanced, but the results were impressive all the same. I spent a lot of time in the workrooms. They smelt strangely, of the medicines that were prepared, of the herbs that were hung up to dry, of deer and of smoke, but it wasn't an unpleasant strangeness. The workers, mostly my aunts and uncles and cousins, though there were a few hirelings who were unrelated to us, were more than happy to indulge my curiosity about what they were doing. I was put to work with a mortar and pestle more than once to grind herbs to paste. The clan was pleased with my interest in medicine, having, as they did, that diagnosis from the hospital. I struggled through the basic textbooks on the subject. It wasn't that the concepts were unfamiliar to me, but the change in language meant I had to learn everything all over again. I could have gotten the same information from reading a dictionary, but it was easier to learn in context. I was thankful to note that the principles seemed the same, despite the differences in worlds. I was vaguely aware that deer velvet was considered a medicine, but in my world it was regarded as something of a herbal remedy, the sort for new age health nuts. However, I remembered with a jolt, here, the Nara were regarded as expert medical specialists. They were the ones that supplied Tsunade with the information that allowed her to reverse Choji's food pill poisoning. I had to try and stop applying knowledge from my past world, things were too different here. The medical sciences were nothing short of amazing, once I got over the fact that the most important and essential medical tools weren't needles and scalpels but paper and ink. Just about everything that we used machines for, they used seals. To stabilize patients, to monitor them, during surgery, all seals. Sealing and medicine went together hand in glove. They had more use, or more easily recognized use, in the stable environment of the hospital than being weirdly adapted in the ever-changing realm of combat. It had never occurred to me before, but Tsunade was probably equal to, if not greater in sealing knowledge than Jiraiya, if her rebirth seal was any indication. Orochimaru's dabbling in cursed seals was also explained by his scientific leanings. Seals were the machines of the elemental nations. Seals are kanji. That surprised me to discover. I had always thought they would involve a specialized alphabet or complex symbols, esoteric lines and circles, but it wasn't. It was kanji. Yes, there were specific ways in which they should be combined for best effect, but in that manner it was more like writing a contract or telling a story. That was interesting to learn. Of course, it was limited. It took time and space and ink and paper. Only the very best seal masters could use seals in combat, because they were the only ones that could design or alter and apply a seal with merely a twist of chakra, a hand seal and maybe some blood. Minato Namikaze was lauded as a genius for a reason. I noted it as an avenue I definitely wanted to explore. I very much doubted I would ever get to any sort of mastery of it, probably never more than the basics, but there was still a lure to it. If nothing else, storage scrolls would be handy. These things filled my time admirably. As the year passed and we entered our second year of the academy, little changed. The lessons became slightly harder, slightly harsher, slightly more geared towards the truth of ninja missions. It was a slow process to familiarize us with what would be expected of us, so slow it was almost unnoticeable. We were being conditioned. In our second year, we started learning how to throw kunai and we started to learn taijutsu. At the academy we were all taught an adaptation of the basic Konoha Ryu style, called the Shorin Ryu, the small forest style. It was a version of the Konoha-based taijutsu style that had been adapted specifically for children and teenagers. It emphasized dodging and deflection with the understanding that any opponents we encountered were likely to be taller, stronger and faster than us. On the surface, it appeared to be a rather simplistic style, with limited numbers of strikes, block and kicks. Of course, given that it was being taught to children, this straightforwardness was probably more an advantage than a disadvantage. There were no flashy moves or complicated locks, things that could easily fall apart in actual combat. It was the basics of the basics, something that we could build on with our family styles, or simply once we left the academy and started gaining personal experience. I had studied karate before, which sounds like it should have given me a bonus in learning taijutsu here. That really wasn't the case. For one, it had been so many years previously that I had forgotten nearly all the technical details. For another, It had been in a separate body. But thirdly, perhaps more importantly, I had never had to actually use karate in a real-life situation. The closest I had come was the single tournament I had participated in, but I was intelligent enough to know that that wasn't even close. Here, taijutsu wasn't just a hobby, it was real. It was something that people lived and died by. And what we were taught reflected that. On the other hand, there were things that I had learned that stood me well. Not the techniques, but more important things than that. Our motto had been, first the body, then the mind, then the spirit. Meaning that your body tired first. Your muscles ached, and trembled, you panted, you sweated. But you kept going. Then your mind became tired. You acknowledged your fatigue. Your determination wavered. You wanted to give up. But your spirit kept you going. It wasn't quite, never give up, but more, persevere. Keep going despite that. It was a hard lesson to learn, to push yourself so hard and so far. Harder still when you were solo training. The second was intent. The easiest way to win a fight is to avoid it. There is no reason to fight if you don't have to. But if there is, if you have to fight, commit to it 100%. Commit to every action as though it will win the fight. You should throw the first punch and throw the last punch and make sure the two of them are the same strike. In the academy they talked about this, they called it, iken hasatsu. To kill with one strike. Here they actually meant it. When we sparred, the others had the tendency to treat it as a game. I was tempted to. Throwing light punches and kicks, dancing around weak attacks, it's fun and easy. And I had no real desire to hurt any of my classmates. On the other hand, it was easy. A knee to the stomach, an elbow to the temple, a palm strike to the jaw, fast and brutal moves that folded the others to the ground instantly. After a few days, the others started calling me, Ko Shikako. It almost made me laugh. It wouldn't last, not as they got better at blocking and dodging, at overcoming that instinctive flinch at violence, at protecting their vital spots, but I'd improve too. We didn't do a lot of freeform sparring, not at first, anyway. It was still mostly stamina exercises, like we had already been doing. Running, press-ups, set-ups, training bag work. There were flexibility exercises, stretches and slalom poles. There were obstacle courses and games like dodgeball. And there were rigidly repeated basics, 100 of this punch, 100 of this kick. For those it was hard to keep up the 100% effort that I was determined to put into my taijutsu. Mentally, motivating myself for it was the hardest part. I'd probably never be a taijutsu master, but I didn't want to be crippled by poor fighting skills or stamina. Of course, my effort had the surprising side effect of motivating the other girls. I guess it was easy for girls like Sakura and Ino, who had high academic scores, to slack off when the highest placed kunoichi in physical scores was Hinata at only slightly higher than the class middle. She was better than that technically, but lacked the aggression to truly compete. Added that Jiyuken strikes were generally forbidden, she was at a serious disadvantage. But no one likes being overshadowed or dropped on their ass repeatedly, and they were genuinely motivated to show me up. Or at least, get me to stop kicking their asses. On days when Jiyuken was allowed, Hinata was the worst opponent for me to face. Even though she could only use those attacks from her hands at this age, they limited the areas that I could strike. The hands have a large range, and can move very quickly. The only area that was really free from their range was below the knee, and even that was compensated for by some of the lower stances. Fighting Hinata like that, more than any of the others, forced me to think ahead. The only strike I could inflict without danger was a leg sweep, and even that put me in grabbing range. I was forced to feint and circle and dodge every strike. To some degree, I did this with the others, anticipating where and how they would strike, how I could retaliate, how to maneuver them into the best position to me. It was interesting to experiment. But it was fighting with Hinata that made me resolve to look up counters to the Jiyuken. either emitted chakra to serve as a shield, or perhaps harnessing my own shadow to take those strikes. Jiyuken hurt. The intrusion of foreign chakra into my system, forcefully, violently, was excruciating. It was like being stabbed and burned and frozen and electrocuted all at once. The first time we fought, I was incapacitated by a mere glancing blow. I built up very little tolerance to it at all. Whenever we fought, most of the class would cheer for her. My habit of beating people swiftly made me an unpopular opponent, and everyone was more than willing to encourage her to beat me. I didn't begrudge her that because she was a genuinely nice girl, if very shy, and that was something I could sympathize with. She was always willing to unblock my tenketsu afterwards, shyly apologizing, regardless of which of us won. It was during my second year that I caught my first, and only, glimpse of Itachi Uchiha. I knew Sasuke quite well, being in his class, but Itachi had slipped my mind. That happened. It was hard to remember the exact details from something that had been only a very small part of my life. Even details as important as this. This is my Itachi ni, Sasuke said, introducing the older boy who had shown up to pick him up from school. Usually his mother came, but not today. He sounded so proud, so adoring of his brother. My heart twisted in guilt, knowing that soon he'd be broken and shattered. Hi, I said, barely loud enough to be heard, staring at my feet. Itachi, already a Junin, already an Anbu. Willing to sacrifice everything for his brother and the village. What would he do if he knew what I knew? I couldn't even contemplate it. I was too selfish. I knew I wouldn't interfere. I would let these horrible and despicable things happen, because they didn't touch me. Didn't touch my family and my safe little world. As much as I told myself, there is nothing I can do, I knew that at heart I was just a selfish coward. Shortly after that we turned 7 and the Uchiha clan lay broken. The whole of Konoha was in a somber, shaken mood. Whatever claims of oppression and hatred Madara made, they weren't noticeable now. These were people that had lost friends, neighbors, comrades, these were people in mourning. Sasuke didn't return to school for several weeks. When he did, he was pale and wild-eyed, snappy and sullen. He avoided everyone and at lunch chose a spot well away from everyone else. He was sitting, back to a tree at the side of the field. It was as isolated as he could get, considering that only final year students were allowed to leave the grounds at break time. A group of girls, including Ino and Sakura, were sitting close by, casting him looks and chattering. Either they had already been repulsed, or they lacked the courage to approach him. I watched him go and tugged on Shika's arm. He was damn good at interpreting what I meant. It should have been scary, but it was just relieving that I didn't have to verbalize it. I wasn't sure what I would have said, in any case. Troublesome, Shikamaru said, but adjusted our course. Choji, bless him, followed without comment. We sat without a word. Sasuke tensed and glared, angry and upset and grieving. I had no doubt that he could be fairly viscous. What do you think you're doing? He hissed. I flinched, but Shikamaru just yawned. Sitting, eating lunch, he said. Well, sit somewhere else. I'm here. You can come sit with us, Sasuke-kun. Ino piped up eagerly from nearby. He cast them a look, half anger, half disgust. Are you going to Suzume-sensei's class tonight, Ino? I asked, thinking it time to intervene. I didn't think we should push too much. There was a very large difference between trying to include Sasuke and bothering him. Of course Ino was going, she never missed a class, but she took the comment in the spirit it was given, as a conversation starter, and began to chat happily with me about our lessons. After a brief moment, Sakura joined in, followed by some of the other girls, while Choji and Shika peacefully ate lunch behind us. Sasuke was alone but not excluded. He was a part of the group without being bothered. Maybe we could head off his loner tendencies. I don't know if it helped, but it was something. And if I was doing it to assuage the guilt in my heart, well, that was my own business. And, at 7, we were deemed ready to begin training in our family art. Nara believe in contingency plans. Every person in the clan, be they ninja or civilian, knows at least the theory of the shadow possession jutsu. That way, if something happened to the clan, there would be someone to pass that knowledge on. They may not have expected me to learn it, but I was still taught. And this was my chance to prove that I could. Learning to infuse object with your chakra is reasonably easy, learning to do it without damaging them is harder, and to infuse an object that has no physical mass, a shadow, harder still. Managing that, then manipulating it, that's the true difficulty. Our clan style isn't a bloodline, but we do have an affinity towards shadow that mimics an elemental affinity. Other people could learn it, but it would take double, triple, maybe quadruple the amount of time, and they would never be as efficient nor as effective at it as us. Given that many of our jutsu are fairly limited, and support types, it's not hard to see why nobody bothers. Of course, there is far more to the art that anyone ever sees. I spent a fair bit of time practicing the shadow possession jutsu after Dad had shown it to us, and we had mastered the basic steps. It took us several months to progress onto creating and maintaining a chakra-infused shadow, and from there we had to begin the tedious process of learning how to manipulate it. It had once been known as the shadow paralysis jutsu, but not so long ago, it had been reinvented to control the victim's movements instead of just paralyzing them. No one says so, but I'm fairly certain the innovation was Dad's. I wanted to be good at it. I practiced the speed of initiation, my hand seals, speed of capture and release, the length I could stretch my shadow, the number of times I could split it, the shape and direction of movement. There were so many parts to it that needed to be perfected. I couldn't hold it for long, however. It was an incredibly intensive technique. Chunin level skill is to be able to hold it for 5 minutes, at this stage one was lucky to be able to hold it for 5 seconds. That was something I couldn't really change. I could perfect my control over it to reduce my chakra wastage, and do what I could to improve my reserves, but until I was older, they wouldn't grow very much at all. And until we had the shadow possession jutsu mastered, the other family techniques were out of our range. Even the next simplest techniques were many times more difficult and exhausting. But apart from my desire to learn and my fascination with all things chakra, which still seemed so magical, no matter how many scientific explanations I read, there was no real pressing need to master it. Most of the time, the impending future slipped my mind, inevitable but ignored like an exam I hadn't studied for. I was trying, and I was training, but single-minded dedication had never suited me. Indeed, Shikamaru barely bothered to learn it before ceasing practice and returning to cloud watching. He too knew he probably should, but didn't have the motivation when there was no immediacy to it. Unlike me, he didn't know the specifics of the looping future, and still held hope that he would be an average ninja, do an average amount of missions and face an average amount of danger. I pestered him into practicing with me as much as I could, but I still feared it wouldn't be enough. Shikamaru, for all his smarts, had been so lucky to survive. And he was smart. Insanely so. By 9 it was incredibly clear that my assumptions about being as smart as Shikamaru had been incredibly arrogant. I wasn't even close. Not even with a 20-year head start. It was a little humbling. I don't know if anyone else saw it, because I was more motivated. I was constantly reading because I liked learning new things, but I knew, and our parents knew. Tactics-wise, he beat me at every turn. Oh, I made him work for it, but he beat me all the same. Games of shogi turned into grueling hour-long contests of wills. It could have very easily lead to things getting nasty between us. I found, much to my chagrin, that I had become decidedly unused to losing. The anger and resentment, once I noticed them, made me distinctly uncomfortable with myself. They were not good emotions to be feeling. It was, after all, just a game. One that I was playing with my brother. It should have been fun. I resolved very quickly that it was going to be. I was going to take a step back, I was going to breathe, and I was going to calm the hell down. I wasn't going to get angry at losing. I was going to see what he'd done better than me, and how I could use it. I was going to treat it as a lesson, not as a failure. After all, I could still learn. I could still improve. I didn't want to be the kind of person that made everything a life or death issue. There was going to be enough of that soon enough. Graduation came far too soon. And brought with it a whole suite of problems that I hadn't anticipated. If we assume that teams will be assigned using the one kunoichi method, you are going to be paired with Ino and Choji, I said to Shikamaru. He kept staring at the clouds. It was likely that he had already reached that conclusion long before. It was practically a given. That wasn't what I wanted to talk about though, that was just a conversation opener, towards the question I couldn't ask, what will happen to me? I didn't think anything would break up the Ino-Shika-Cho grouping, and putting more than one kunoichi on a team generally lead to a weaker, less stable team, or so was the official line. I wasn't quite sure I believed it. For the same reason, I was almost sure that Hinata, Shino and Kiba would be teamed together. Their combination of abilities complemented each other nicely, for tracking, search and rescue, or non-lethal capture missions. Which left me dreading team assignment. I was friends with Naruto, and friendly with Sasuke, and the top-ranked kunoichi, but I didn't particularly want to be on Team 7. Not with all the trouble that they would attract. Shoulda thought of that before scoring 100% on all those tests. I had never purposefully done less than my best before, so it was hard to think I should have now. On the other hand, I didn't really know many of the others. I was semi-friendly with a few, and sure I could have dragged them to a team pass, but none stood out as anything special. Not like the rookie 9. What about Sakura? I wondered. If I was placed on Team 7, what would happen to her? The answer was obvious. She wasn't quite the friendless fangirl she had been in the anime, but she still lacked ambition, drive, realism, even common sense sometimes. She would fail. Guilt gnawed the pit of my stomach. Shoulda damn well thought ahead. Something so central to a ninja's life should have occurred to me ahead of time. But even if it had, I wasn't sure what I would have done about it.